Good evening. Is there anybody in this room that doesn't know Glenn Withers? It makes it very easy tonight, doesn't it? Glenn is president of the Academy of Social Sciences, we all know. He's also professor of economics at ANU and UNSW. He's been an advisor to governments, business, and community organizations to the benefit of all of those groups. He was awarded an Order of Australia for his design of the Australian Immigration Point System, and helped to establish not only the Productivity Commission, but the Crawford School, ANZOG, and Universities Australia. Glenn's now going to take the mic. He will introduce our guests and continue with the show. So, thank you very much.
Well, I actually thought you were going to introduce each of the speakers, John, but and I don't have the full details, but I can quickly avoid all the long reading out of Vitae by introducing you to Don Nutbeam, who's associated these days with the University of Sydney and well known in the public health arena, but also was particularly pertinently to tonight's discussions for some time Vice-Chancellor of Southampton University in the UK. And I think what we'll be doing is taking people in the order we're seated. So Don will be followed then by Anne Harding, who people in Canberra and beyond know very well, particularly because of her great work on microsimulation modelling, but also many people, some of the people in this room I know probably even worked with Anne when she was a bureaucrat at one point in her development and then moved into academic life. So we're very pleased to have Anne joining us tonight. And David Grant is a professor at Griffith University and is Deputy Chair of the Business Deans, or Chair.
Secretary.
Secretary,
not sure
okay.
what that means, but
well, in Canberra, that's an elevated title.
Right,
so
that's true. Yeah.
And David will be capable of giving us business school type perspectives and more, obviously, of course. And what we're going to do is run it as a panel. I was going to finish up as the last speaker and then just open it up for discussion. But the topic is social science research making its mark on Australia, and the agenda behind that is this emergence of impact and engagement approaches that are being increasingly exhorted for universities to adopt. So that's the emerging theme that we're waiting a report from the Australian Research Commission's report and the Department of Education's report, joint report, to the government, and we're waiting on the release of the government's decisions about the report it's received from those agencies. So it's an opportunity tonight to get some last words in and anticipate where this might go and what our actions may be when some announcements are made in this area, and also more generally, of course, what we would wish to see scholarship doing in terms of these sorts of criteria. So with that as background, let me quickly hand over to Don Nutbeam to particularly reflect, of course, on his UK experience, but on where he sees the whole area at these days. Don.
Thanks very much. Shall I get up there or just stay
Depends
here?
if you need a microphone. Can people hear okay down there?
I'm sure people
you're
can
comfortable
hear.
there.
I'm sure people can hear me. Thanks very much for the introduction, and a couple of things
sorry, can we just say, is it recording okay for...
Yeah.
We don't have to go to the microphone for recording. Thank you.
A couple of things to say, just to add by way of introduction. I am a social scientist, even though I've worked in medical faculties all of my academic career. And unusually for a Vice-Chancellor in the United Kingdom, I had to have my contract changed because Vice-Chancellors are classified as administrative and managerial staff in the British higher education system. I had to have my contract changed so that I could be at least part-time classified as an academic member of staff, so that my work could be submitted as part of the University of Southampton submission to the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, in the UK. And I desperately tried to remain research active during my period as a Vice-Chancellor, but it's actually quite hard to find the time to do that. But nonetheless, I was actually part of the most recent UK Research Excellence Framework assessment. What I thought I could usefully contribute to the discussion this evening is not to turn up fresh from the UK to tell you how you should do things in Australia. I've learned from living here on and off for 27 years now that's not a really sensible thing to do if you're a POM. But I can at least reflect on my experience of impact as a social scientist and a Vice-Chancellor in the UK system. And my interpretation, very idiosyncratic interpretation, I'd have to say, not an official view, but my interpretation of how decisions were made and why about the inclusion of impact and the way in which impact was included in the REF in the UK. Whether that's of any use to current discussions in Australia, I'll leave that for you to determine and interpret. I'd like to start where all good stories in Britain begin, and that's dinner at the Houses of Parliament. And as was the way of the minister responsible for higher education, a guy called David Willits, 6-7 years ago, a group of Vice-Chancellors were invited for a fine dinner at the Houses of Parliament to talk about the state of higher education in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, and how was it that we were going to be done over as were almost all publicly funded systems and services in the UK at that time. And we had a very good discussion, very good in the sense that it was very open and honest, I think, about the state of government finances and the challenges that were being faced by the government at that time. But the minister, to his great credit, wanted to talk to us about the best way to defend investment in research in the UK. And to cut a long story short, he said, you've got to tell a better story. You've got to simply get into the public domain and into the political domain and tell a better story about how public money invested in research is delivering economic and social benefit. And he was very open and honest. It wasn't an aggressive conversation, but it was the start of a discussion about impact and how it should become part of the landscape for the assessment of research in the UK. And it certainly was one of a number of conversations, I suspect, that led the minister to decide that impact assessment would form part of the 2015 REF in the UK. And it was a very clear decision. There was no debate. It was going to form part of the assessment, and the only debate was going to be in what form would that take. So that's the first point. It started with a very clear intention that universities should do a better job of explaining the social and economic benefit of public investment in research. We then had the normal meltdown that academic communities are great at having. I'm sure it hasn't happened in Australia. I feel confident about that. But honestly, the sky was going to fall in because impact was to be included in research assessment. And there were a lot of people running around as if the sky was going to fall in. And there was a lot of unhelpful and unproductive discussion, I think, in the very early days around this. And a part of it I'd like to illustrate for you that emerged as an important decision along the way. So I was Vice-Chancellor at the University of Southampton. In the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis, we were actually quite cash rich and able to invest in building an infrastructure. and because building costs were greatly reduced, the building industry collapsed basically immediately in the wake of the global financial crisis in the UK, we were able to commission building at a fairly low, it was an obvious time for us to build. As it turned out, over a period of time that I was Vice-Chancellor, and in the 5 years immediately following the global financial crisis, we invested £100 million a year in building an infrastructure, and we were a very important contributor to economic development and the maintenance of the economy in the city of Southampton at that time. We had really important local economic impact in our community. And one of the anxieties and part of the debate that we had in the UK was the nature of impact. And what we wanted to do was to very clearly differentiate between that type of impact, which was real and meaningful in the community, and research impact. And a very important and early decision is that consideration of impact was a derivative of excellent research. And I know it sounds really obvious now, but you'll be amazed at the kinds of conversations that were taking place at the time. And I suppose the first point I would make is that it is about research impact. And I notice you have the term engagement and impact, and I'm still not quite sure how you differentiate between those issues and whether engagement means you're spending money in your local community and working with the local community, or whether it really is connected to excellence in research. But it's very clear in the UK from the very early days that impact was all about the impact of high quality research. And the first issue was, is a university conducting high quality research? And then, what impact is that high quality research having? So it was an early decision, but a really important decision. The next point at which people went into complete meltdown was in what form should impact be assessed? And there were very strong advocates for a metrics-based system because it was clean, convenient, possibly more transparent and verifiable than other methods. But very clearly, if I can be honest, would discriminate in favour of those disciplines that were more metrics-based in their outcomes relative to those that aren't. So, for example, certainly in my university, those working in the humanities and in the arts were anxious about how this would fall out. In truth, the decisions were taken under such pressure that it really wasn't possible to get agreement around any kind of a metrics-based system, and so the UK moved quickly to a decision that all disciplines should essentially be based on assessed on case studies, and this at least meant that each discipline, whether it was the arts or the physical sciences, had an opportunity to tell a story. Had the opportunity to use metrics where metrics were available, but weren't obliged to try to convert the story they had to tell into a set of metrics. I have to say it's a lot less efficient than metrics only, and there were real costs and definitely opportunity costs associated with going down this route, but it was the fastest way in which we could achieve agreement. And I have to say, I think it was a smart decision in the end. What it meant was that universities were able to submit in the normal established way a set of metrics to do with research income, outputs, and training outputs in the way that REF is quite well established now, playing a game that we all knew and were familiar with, and that 80% of the assessment of a university's research performance would be based on this metric set that we were already well acquainted with. We trusted the process, we understood and trusted the process, and universities were a fundamental part of the process of assessment. So there was a high degree of peer assessment in the process. Separate to that, each university was required to submit case studies depending on the number of academics whose work was submitted as a part of the REF. And I know your system is different here, but the REF in the UK allows universities to submit the work of chosen academics and is not obliged to submit the work of all academics in the community. But I think it was, I have to forgive me, it was for every 8 academics, you had to provide 1 case study to illustrate impact. We went about this, and it was an extraordinary experience, I have to say, very challenging in disciplines like archaeology and philosophy, to be able to demonstrate social and economic impact, but I think actually really challenging in the most positive way rather than a negative way, and it stimulated the entire university community to be thinking a lot more openly about how we communicated effectively the impact of what we were doing to a much broader community and public and political audience. Happy to talk into more detail about how we handled that tactically. What I wanted to say, though, is at the end of this, I have to say, this was like a Vice-Chancellor's dream. I had an endless supply of well-written examples of the impact that the university was having in our community. I had great examples from the social sciences, particularly of social and economic impact, not in the rather narrow sense of, we created IP and we sought to derive commercial value from our IP, although there was a bit of that. Many of the examples that we used were the influence that we had on public policy, for example, that had significant, profound social and economic consequences for the country, and tangible impacts in ways that ordinary people in the community could actually understand. And so for me, as a Vice-Chancellor, this set of case studies was an extraordinary resource in terms of communicating what higher education was about and what it was delivering for society, what investment in research could deliver. I would say nationally, I'll be bold here and say it more or less ended the debate about the research budget. Because by the end of this process, there are over 7,000 individual case studies, of which there are several thousand that are really, really good case studies, showing without any shadow of a doubt that public investment in research delivers tangible social and economic benefit. And there's a case study for every constituency. There's a case study for every ministry. There's a case study for most communities and most people's lives. And this was a tremendous resource for public advocacy, for public investment in research. And as I say, at a time when all public spending has been under intense pressure in the UK, the public investment in research has been maintained. And by comparison, on average, public spending in all unprotected areas, the 2 protected areas were education and health, in all unprotected areas, average public expenditure cuts were 35%. And the research budget was protected and maintained, and has been maintained throughout the period following the global financial crisis. So if ever there was an argument for accountability that supports advocacy, I think this was it. And I have to say, I've become, as you can probably tell, quite an advocate for impact. I'm a bit more of a fan of case studies than I am of pure metrics, because I think it allows for storytelling across the spectrum of disciplines, and I think it's a good way of linking the excellent research that's going on in universities with tangible outcomes that the public and politicians can more easily understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And now we can move across to Anne. I should mention, by the way, that Jane Hall was going to be on the committee, and Jane has contracted an eyesight infection, which meant she couldn't travel from Sydney, but it's temporary. So Anne has done us the world of a favour by deciding to join us and grace us with her presence tonight. And as someone who's been very active in the interface between universities and research and impact, this is a wonderful opportunity to hear from Anne's experience. So Anne, over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Can you all hear me okay if I sit here too? Okay. So my comments are going to be quite narrowly focused in that I was in a particular area of the social sciences, which is social policy. So I apologise in advance if these aren't translatable as readily to other areas of the social sciences. So inexplicable though it may seem to me, some of you may never have heard of NatSem, which was the research centre that dominated my life for more than 2 decades. So NatSem was the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling at the University of Canberra, set up in 1993. And we did research across the spectrum of social policy and applied economic policy. And the really critical thing that NatSem did was, apart from a sort of plethora of applied economic and social research, was to develop microsimulation models. And the key thing about those was that they were based on individuals and simulating processes, rules of government programs, etc., being applied to people, anonymised people, but nonetheless individuals. And that gave policymakers the most extraordinary capacity to add together the results for all those representative types of individuals and work out what the impacts of their policies, their favoured policy change would be on sole parents with 2 children, or the unemployed, or of more concern to some people, high income taxpayers with 2 children. So in order to eliminate today's discussion, I wanted to take you briefly through a case study. So one of effectively many policy reform processes that I was heavily involved with over the 2 decades. And in this case, it's a study of my participation in the reform of the Australian Child Support Scheme back in the early 2000s, and one of my fellow colleagues from that, David Stanton, is in fact here today. So child support is that area where they try to work out the financial relationships between custodial and non-custodial parents, and how the burdens or benefits of making financial contributions to the raising of children should be split between the parents. And as in fact Meredith Edwards and others here can attest to, child support is one of those very vexed areas of social policy that no one can ever agree on. Okay, it's a minefield to step into in any way. But in 2004, in August 2004, the government responded at that time to concerns about the scheme and decided to initiate a ministerial task force on child support. And I was one of the 7 members of that task force, along with David, along with others. Now, the chair of that task force was a bold and innovative academic who wanted to radically change the structure of the then existing child support scheme that we had in Australia. And he wanted to make the formula for child support much more clearly based on sharing the financial costs between the 2 parents. And the system he was wanting to explore had been utilised in a couple of the United States, but to my knowledge had never been modelled using microsimulation before we attempted it. And so in addition to me being on the task force, NatSem was also commissioned to undertake a consultancy to allow the task force to simulate alternative rules upon dozens of types of hypothetical families that would be potentially captured within the web. And in essence, this project was an absolute nightmare. It was extraordinarily complicated. The The complexity of the family structures that we had to model was beyond anything I had ever encountered in the previous 15 years of modelling social policy. We had blended families and step families, as well as split up nuclear families and sole parents. We had everything, and we had them at all sorts of different income levels, right up from people who were dependent on social security to people who earned hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxable income. And the whole thing had to be structured so that novices, the other members of the committee, with the exception of David, were easily able to change the rules of the scheme that they wanted to look at the impact of and quickly spit out, this is how much people would win, this is how much they would lose, and this is how much it would cost the taxpayer and each parent. So very complicated. And I did nothing else for 6 months but work on this task force model. It absolutely blew all my other research commitments completely out of the water. And the point I wanted to make about this was that often issues explode on the policy agenda, often in response to a crisis of some sort. That's how you get issues up on the policy agenda often, and that's how you get change. And in this case, the task force was originally given about 7 months to undertake this comprehensive review, simulate the new system, reach conclusions about what the system should look like, draft the report, get it to government, and have the whole thing go through. And of course, we weren't able to quite meet those timelines, and we got 2 extensions, but it was still what I would characterise as a very hot policy process. And any of you who've ever been close to the policy process, when policy is being made, will know that that is very frequently a very hot policy process. It's more typically that than a nice, slow, reasoned policy process. So in that typical environment for policy change, things move very quickly, and the focus is not on academic processes that can take years to come to fruition, such as applying for ARC grants or publishing in the top journals. The imperative is to achieve social change while the opportunity is there. So in the event, a report was given to the government on this proposed new child support scheme in late 2005, and a new child support scheme was then implemented, embodying these new rules. So that was really quite rare to have that go through, and you'd only got to ask Alan Finkel and Gonski about that. So given that that new child support scheme by now would have affected the lives of some 4 to 5 million Australians, I think many people would conclude that in the real world this effort should score quite highly for impact and engagement. But to look at how it would be metricised under standard academic metrics, the task force did publish a final report. It was under the names of all the committee members. That was freely available on the web to anybody who wanted it. And really, in essence, that has no academic standing whatsoever, right? This doesn't count. And I got special permission to publish one academic article in a highly ranked Australian public administration journal. And I must say, at the time, the research quality framework was just starting, and so we all had a big interest at the time in how often our research was being cited. And when I looked on impact assessments back then, it was appalling to me how infrequently social science articles were cited. And so, in fact, this one academic article I managed to get out with ministerial permission about how we redesigned the child support scheme in a technical sense, a modelling sense. When I looked on Google today, that has been cited 7 times in the intervening decade. Okay? And I think what that reflects is what one of my friends, who was a professor of economics, in fact, in Britain, said, no one is interested in Australian social policy. You know, like, social policy is very culturally specific. It's embedded in the values and the mores of the society in which you operate. And our system is very different to that, you know, applying in most of the European systems, certainly in the American and Canadian systems. And I think HECS is perhaps the one exception to that, where vast tracts of that social policy have been exported to affect the social policy of other nations. But this situation of it being so culturally specific is very different to that prevailing in the hard sciences. So if you're in the hard science, medical science, and you publish some human genome breakthrough in Nature, whatever it is, then that's instantly translatable to people right across the world. That has benefits for humans right across the world. And the same is not true of the social science research here. And so it can be very, very difficult to try to publish Australian social research in internationally refereed journals. And partly in response to that problem, when I was president of the International Microsimulation Association, which was a relatively newly formed association, we set up an international microsimulation journal. And because the underlying ethos of all the people in that association was that we wanted to maximise social benefits, that journal was freely available to anyone who wanted it over the web. We all wrote up whatever technical features and breakthroughs we had made so that they were readily exportable to other places free of charge. In this rather specialised audience of developers and users of microsimulation models, but nonetheless, these sorts of models have now underpinned an awful lot of social security and tax policy right across the world. It's not just specific to here really, but it is still a very narrow specialised field compared to, say, human genome research. So much for publications. Clearly the task force was a complete waste of sort of 6 to 8 months in that regard. Well, how about research income? Well, I wasn't paid to be on the task force. And while NatSam did receive consultancy income for the task of building the model, that income would not be highly regarded in our traditional peer-reviewed performance metrics because it wasn't peer-reviewed grant income. It was like well down the pecking order as consultancy income. So really I've been pondering the days leading up to this. What does this say about our traditional performance metrics when they're applied to the social sciences here in Australia? And I think if you effectively receive no academic brownie points for research that demonstrably affects the lives of millions of Australians, then this suggests that there might be something wrong with applying those traditional quantitative metrics to the social sciences. And it seems to me that to contribute to really active policy processes, you need to participate in other ways apart from the standard academic processes like refereed journal articles and the ARC grants with industry partners. And so I've been thinking about what would be possible metrics. And again, I apologise, these are, in fact, as you so ably said, Don, I think these would reflect much more the use of case studies rather than metrics about how many did you get in A-star refereed journals published internationally. And possible metrics to me would include things like whether the academic involved participated in any public policy relevant committees that were established by governments or government departments. In my view, anyone who leads any sort of inquiry or task force for the government deserves a medal, without a shadow of doubt. No, it destroys their personal life for months on end, and possibly their reputation for the rest of time as well, If you have any adoption of your ideas or proposals or your research within public policy, again, I think you should be lauded for that. You have done this, you have notched that up really at tremendous personal gain, and really with large academic sacrifices, because for the months and months you spend doing public policy work in these public forums, they're all time you cannot devote to writing refereed journal articles and so on. I think another possible metric is if your research is cited in Parliament or in parliamentary committees or by policymakers or by parliamentarians, so including government departments. That if you're called to meetings or to give seminars at Parliament House or in other large public forums, that if there's press coverage of your ideas and your research, if you're actively contributing in the public space, which Don also brought up. I mean, I have never done this, but even if I'd go so far as to saying if you're writing blogs, or writing media articles, or participating in media conferences or other conferences about your topic of expertise. And the reason for that, in part, is that being involved in public policy is a very bruising process. The political game can be not always played in the polite way that academic debates have traditionally been played. You know, it can be a very bruising personal experience. And I think any academics who are going out there to face that sort of flack in the interests of good public policy deserve some recognition for that, and not to be marked down because they haven't achieved on the traditional academic metrics that we have used until now. I was going to add that as I was saying, that when I was doing this process, the first research quality framework was starting, and it went on to be followed by the Excellence in Research for Australia round. And to be honest, that was one of the factors that made me decide to take early retirement. So I just felt that the focus on publishing in 5-star international journals was a totally inadequate performance indicator in my particular field. And I understand completely that my particular field is very different to other people's fields often. But I had started NatSem to try to influence public policy, to try to improve the lives of millions of Australians. And that as my university's performance measures shifted towards the metrics that were then being used by the Australian Research Council, I couldn't really justify all those long hours spent away in Qantas Club in Brisbane on a Friday night as the plane was delayed yet again, you know, just wanting to be home. And I do understand absolutely entirely that it's incredibly difficult for the ARC to develop these sorts of indicators of research quality. The ARC has been an enormous supporter of mine over the years, and I think that they try to do an incredibly difficult job to the absolute best of their ability. But it just seems to me that there has to be a better way to judge whether we are affecting the lives of people in a substantive way. Anyway, so I did the smart thing and moved on to other ways to help our society. So in conclusion, I hope you found this helpful, and I hope it will inform debate about where we might go in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. I don't know if you know it, but you fulfilled a Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser dream. He was complaining about the macro modelling he was getting from Treasury, the National Income Forecasting Model and so on. And he said, for me, I want to know what the distribution is and how typical Australians are affected by this. And you're not giving me that information. Well, that's exactly what you've done over your career. And I'm not sure what happens to the H-index for micro-simulation, but you do get a building named after you at the University of Canberra. And I think that beats an H-index any day of the week. So congratulations and thank you. David, your turn.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. And thanks for the invitation to speak tonight. I was asked to speak on, or give a business school perspective, I guess, on engagement and impact, and how business schools might think of themselves as impacting on government, business and other communities that we serve and work with. And of course, we've got a strong interest in this issue. You know, we're home to a range of social science disciplines. We produce a third of graduating students in Australia a year, and 2/3 of the top 50 company CEOs in Australia have got a business-related degree. I also have a strong personal interest in this issue. I'm a fellow of ASA, and with Stephen Taylor, Professor Stephen Taylor from UTS, who was recently elected into ASA, I did put forward a submission from the Australian Business Deans Council, of which I'm secretary, to the ARC during the consultation exercise. I guess a couple of caveats I might say before I go on. I'm going to be talking about engagement and impact. I see engagement as activities that lead to impact. That's perhaps a little bit different to how Don described the UK starting point, which is about quality research. Is it having impact? But I think that's we can talk about that later. Also, I'm going to only focus on social science research and its impact, but of course, business schools, like any other social science discipline, do engage and impact in other ways. You know, we do it through for example, our social science focused executive education to help address problems in particular organisations, and we've already talked about taking thought leadership roles, as Anne's mentioned, in various bodies, and indeed the ASA report that was produced talks about the Reserve Bank membership, etc. So that's good examples. Today I'm going to focus on three things, and I was asked to avoid a bit of too much overlap with what Don and Anne have spoken about. So I'm going to talk firstly about a little bit of I call it context and history in the case of business schools and the emergence of impact as an issue. It would be fair to say that there's a bit of a difference in the case of business schools as to how and why the importance and significance of impact has emerged. I also want to talk about, secondly, about silos, interdisciplinarity, and the impact of these issues on impact, if you like. That's quite important, and that will bring me round to my third point, which is to just make a few observations, if you will, about the ALC impact in the engagement assessment exercise. So to start with the first of these, the issue of context and history. I guess the current impact and engagement exercise is somewhat driven by the government's current NISA agenda. But as I think Anne mentioned, impact did actually raise its head under the RQF, and then it went away. It was kind of pushed out for a range of reasons. But business schools actually have a long-standing interest and exposure, if you like, to the issue of impact. Certainly since the early 2000s, it's been a debate. In fact, there's been a lot of self-agonising in the business school community in Australia, but more widely globally. And agonising not just about the impact of research, but also about the impact and relevance of our teaching and what we're producing through our degrees in terms of graduates, and what value they're adding to society. Certainly I can remember in the mid-2000s, the AACSB, which is a major accrediting body for business schools in Australia, produced, here it is, this report, The Impact of Research. And I remember that falling on my desk as an Associate Dean Research and reading it. And I'll be honest, I read it and the language was quite foreign to me. It felt quite different, and there was a difference of emphasis. And that debate, though, has extended out from beyond business schools, and now we see it with this particular debate around the forthcoming pilot that the ALC is running, and it's extended out to all academic disciplines across not just the social sciences, of course, but in the STEM space as well. And so we have seen debates more around the issue of sort of theoretical blue sky versus practical applied research. Indeed, to go back to Don's analogy, it's about the blue sky falling in. But I think we shouldn't get too carried away by that. But business schools, though, because of the debate I mentioned earlier, have tended to respond to these expectations surrounding impact somewhat similarly to the experience Don was talking about in the UK. We have been more active in setting in place measures that relate to impact, in part because the accrediting bodies have forced us to respond in that way. So our accreditors, our peer accreditors, have set in place impact measures already. Certainly we realised that it's not simply a case that we weren't doing impact. We were, and we were doing research through engagement. But what we were failing to do was articulate properly, shout about what we're doing effectively. And in that sense, I'm very much welcome the ASA report, because that's what it's doing. It's showing what social science research can do. And we realised that quite quickly in the business school space. So again, we felt it was an important resource, and that's Don's point too from his UK experience. So in my school, for example, in my business school, there are numerous examples and stories, and they're really important stories and narratives of engagement and impact. Simple stories, but ones that are very meaningful, of working with DFAT and Pacific Island Reserve Banks to actually upskill, improve capability in those institutions, of working with big data to model tourism behaviour, of a major integrity project, which is in part funded by the ARC, but also with government and industry backing more broadly to establish policy and legal frameworks, and so on. And we can all point to those examples in our business schools. What's also important is that there are plenty of other examples at local, national and international levels in the ASSA report itself, in that Social Sciences Shape the Nation report. Very important. And on that report, there's something else, though, that I want to highlight, that ASSA report highlights for me, and that I think is very important to add on to the issues raised by Anne and Don. And that's the importance of social science research and its impact where it's interdisciplinary. Social science disciplines often come together to prosecute major projects or programs of research that have very significant impact in the areas of education or of public health, Don's areas, or social change, the environment, and so on. And those are actually illustrated in the ASSA report. And I think it's unsurprising that interdisciplinarity occurs. I'd have to choose a difficult word as the centre of my point, but that occurs because it's fueled by at least two factors. The first is the obvious one, that big issues, be those sort of social, economic, and so on, those are big issues and challenges often require cross-disciplinary collaboration and teamwork to be fully addressed, or certainly a programme of research that's cross-disciplinary. That's the first point. But the second point is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that stakeholders themselves are increasingly organising across silos to deal with these issues and expect to relate to us in the same way. So if you look at, particularly in government, you see cross-agency responses to major social issues in health and education, for example. So there's that drive there for our research. And the very fact that we respond in this way is a good evidence in itself of the engagement that's taking place. There are implications, it seems to me, of this for the ARC assessment exercise. There is an interdisciplinary code, but it's one code. And it's the majority of course of assessment is based on 2-digit codes. So I just wonder if we're missing something. Are we in danger of kind of under-assessing where a lot of social science impact occurs? And it doesn't stop there for me. Big research programs are not just interdisciplinary in the sense of interdisciplinary within the social sciences. They actually bring together disciplines across the STEM and HASS. And a simple example at my own institution at Griffith University, Pacific nations and rising sea levels, huge issue. There at Griffith we have disciplines from the business school in tourism, because we have an ecotourism expertise, econometricians, macro modelers, all from the business school, working with engineers, marine scientists, climate change scientists, urban planners and so on, modelling future effects of rising sea levels on these Pacific nations and how to mitigate these, what's to be done. That seems to me to be pretty significant impact, or potentially, but it's very much interdisciplinary and across not just the social sciences, but out into HASS. It's a holistic approach, and it's an approach that's an increasing trend, often actually encouraged when you look at the funding mechanisms, such as for the CRCs and so on. And also by our universities, big cross-disciplinary research centres where Don works, for example. The Charles Perkins Centre at Sydney is a great example of that. It's dealing with cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, major global issues, but it has to do it right across disciplines. It's truly interdisciplinary. And I just wonder whether, given some of the varying, the forms of assessment that we're talking about and the structure of the assessment process under the ARC pilot, whether we're going to miss some of this. There's an assumption of the siloing of research here. I'm not sure whether the assessment exercise is able to adequately capture and assess what I'm talking about. My question there would be a question for Don. How did they perhaps deal with that in the UK? My other anxiety related to this is about the very people that we're supposed to be engaging with, and that the engagement and impact assessment exercise is about, and that's industry. While the the assessment exercise might respond to NISA and address government concerns and so on. And I guess it makes us focus a bit more on the issue, which is a good thing. I'm not actually sure it aligns with the real needs and expectations of industry when it comes to addressing the issues and challenges that they face. Its structure doesn't enable us to show how we sort of respond to these issues with industry and work together with industry. And the exercise doesn't seem to especially interest industry at the moment. I'm not picking up a great deal of response from industry. And when I say industry, I'm using it in a broad term, includes government agencies and so on. It doesn't give them anything much. Indeed, there seems to have been limited engagement from industry, for example, on the panels, as I understand it. It's been hard to get industry really switched on with this. Again, I wonder how that was dealt with in the UK case. I think I'll stop there. I wanted to throw those issues into the debate because I think they're important. They've perhaps not been hugely considered in the debate to date about impact and engagement, but I think they're critically important.
Great, thank you, David. Now, am I right in thinking Griffith's been getting some nice coverage recently for work integrated learning as well?
Some good stuff, yeah.
Part of its curriculum initiative, so that's
yes, indeed, thank you.
Practicing what we're preaching in the education area,
indeed,
the industry engagement. Thank you. I should, of course, emphasise that this evening is under the Karmel banner for a Karmel forum, and that Peter Karmel, who is, amongst other things, Vice-Chancellor of the ANU and President of the Academy of Social Sciences, practiced very much what we're talking about tonight. He was a superb engager of government, as in major inquiries into the future of education and the like. So it's very appropriate that we've conducted this evening's activities in the Karmel name. And as a government advisor, of course, Karmel was one of many. I note that I think David cited the number of CEOs who have studied business, of course, which is very large. Equally, I picked out a figure from our Shaping the Nation report that 62% of SES 1 and above in Canberra, to give a Canberra dimension to this, social science graduates on terms of our educational impact. So a little like rankings, to the extent then public policy in Australia from the senior public service is working well, it's all because of the social sciences. If there are troubles, then it's about time they look to the way they structure and manage themselves inside the public service. Their training was impeccable. I was in China last week at the time of the Congress, the 19th Communist Party Congress, and it was interesting that I tried to keep in touch with the Australian news at the same time, and I learnt about the tribulations of the citizenship group and so on. But I didn't see anything in Australian news very much about the Congress in China. There it was just absolutely dominant everywhere. And one of the things at its core was ambition for its university system to... Oh, everyone's supposed to turn off their phones, please. That at the centre of their system is going to be the ambition, for instance, of increasing the doubling the number of universities in China in the Shanghai Jiaotong ARWU rankings by 2049. That means, because the top 200, that means about 25 other universities are going to get knocked out. You're going to get 25 more Chinese universities in the top. So there's going to be an interesting race to the top, in this case, into the future. But equally, that's a focus they're putting on the old measures of excellence. What they didn't talk about in the new party's commitments was what happens to the other sort of 1,350 Chinese universities. What are they going to be looking at as criteria for their advancement, since the focus is on the elite group at the top? And equally, there's very little discussion about vocational education training in the 3 or 4 days of party discussions that were taking place. So there's some bigger issues there than as to research excellence alone. And what I found when at the end of the week, we had an international higher education conference, and the conversation turned immediately to impact and engagement. And they wanted to know from the British folk there exactly what had been the British experience, and they wanted to know what we were doing in Australia. And what was interesting is that the non-elite universities looked like having an impact and engagement agenda visited to them through the provincial government rather than through the central government. And each provincial government will decide upon its metrics rather than a one-size-fits-all metric which will apply for the elite group at the top. And so what was also interesting about the discussion was once we got into it, what they were interested in, I took away the following sort of issues that they saw as problematic. It's valuable to recognise impact and engagement, and they meant the Australian sense of activity and then outputs and outcomes from the process. But they felt that metrics alone are less likely to motivate scholars than a research excellence exercise. There will be some a possibility of behavioural change, but until finance incentives are attached, how do you really think you're going to influence behaviour? And hence, with something that's sort of unstated in Australia, or when you ask government or the ARC or others, there's no immediate tie to finance of this incoming impact and engagement agenda. And the Chinese were slightly puzzled as to how you expect, coming from a communist country, how do you expect behaviour to change unless you're going to bribe people to change with financial incentives like in a good capitalist system? So they were puzzled about what might happen with finance, and is this just a governmental thing where you start the system and then you bring in the financial link? So there's a lot of discussion of how they would do that. They also were worried about gaming, which of course we're very aware of around here because it happens with the excellence criteria anyway. How you get proof in your documentation of your case studies, forge letters from ministers' offices under the name of the minister, and the minister doesn't know they're signing these letters or whatever it is. What will be the bureaucratic load? Is there a real cost-benefit analysis for this compared to the time and effort that will go into compliance and reporting, just as does in the research excellence exercise? Does it justify the changes that may or may not take place as a result of these exercises? And we've had some discussion of that already. Some of this is political. This is not the ARC's obligations and interpretations. It goes ahead and does bureaucratic work. But just as Don indicated, if you can demonstrate to ministers a whole bunch of anecdotes, then it would mean for someone like myself at University of Australia, I wouldn't await with trepidation the annual release of the ARC grants, whereby 6 backbenchers of a malicious kind will pick out the ones that are most offensive to them and then publicise the waste of public money that goes on in postmodernism for feminist legal studies for the advancement of socio-economic understanding and the advancement of global peace. This is the sort of thing that you get every year and have to be ready to try and answer. But when you've got a portfolio of these case studies, you are in a good position to show really some great stuff that is happening that doesn't allow easy points from the back bench from some particular players. There's also an issue, though, as to they were puzzled about the structure of our system. Is this just universities? Are all universities research institutions? And then, if they are, what about other areas like what I explained to them with TAFEs? And why can't TAFEs become the applied research entity? Why must universities be the source of applied, engaged, impact research? That it's TAFEs that would probably be the people most linked to industry, most linked to the community, and therefore put the structure on them and give them financial incentive. And that way have a system that all boats move upwards rather than having divisions within the university structure. And another was, will you be checking and measuring the impact or engagement per dollar that is expended, so that you can get impact and engagement from a $5 million accelerator, or you can get impact and engagement from a lone scholar sitting in their office and writing, as say Peter Singer did, Animal Rights, or as Dennis Altman did, Gay Liberation. And those 2 books had a huge impact around the world on the way we see ourselves as peoples and the way we conduct ourselves in our cultures and relationships. and yet didn't require a nucleon accelerator or whatever to get there. Per dollar, how should you be spending your money? Just the sort of issues they were trying to raise. So there was perfect economic rationalism going on in China at the time of these meetings, and I thought quite interesting for us to look at. And in the end, it came down to acceptance. There's a possible bias, which for the Academy of Social Sciences is an issue. It looked like what systems you can devise would end up doing is say, go STEM, go expensive, and go collective. Collective authorship will be accepted in various ways, and collective collaborative projects will generate more points in various ways through co-fundings and co-supervisions and so on. And they thought there were some problems in their case for developing the humanities and social sciences that they are wanting to do inside the university, subject to the strictures coming out of the President's new thoughts. But they were worried about whether this would be a biased system in terms of which disciplines would be favoured. And again, we've heard some explication on that. So how to proceed? What one way they thought was not have a one-size-fits-all system, but rather think of it as maybe varying indicators. That is, just don't have 20 indicators that every discipline has to respond to, and equally don't have fixed weights. That you just don't divide, because you manage to find 20 indicators, don't just divide them up into 20 equal criteria, but give them weights according to various evidence and research that shows they're linked to impact and engagement. Now, how you would do that, we didn't get into, but it was interesting that was one of the conclusions of the discussion. Have a more flexible rather than a one-size-fits-all system. So coming out of discussions with Chinese communist academics and officials, there were the party secretaries there and so on, I found this desire for flexibility quite engaging. And they did think case studies would be one very useful factor for helping humanities and social science involvement. One final thing I wanted to say before I finish, though, was let's get beyond the metrics. That is, there's a bigger issue here, and I take great encouragement from Don's depiction of the settling down of the UK system. That once you got over the particulars of this, and most, as we well know, most universities in particular will adjust around this and play the game their own little way and get used to whatever the arrangements are, as long as it's nothing absolutely fundamentally new, but something we're expecting, we've participated in the process, unless the minister comes up with a sort of revolution, then we will be able to adjust our behaviour and keep delivering, as Australian universities have reasonably well. But what can we do beyond dealing with and responding to the metrics of an exercise like the Impact and Engagement Project to also be good universities in terms of delivering excellent pure research, delivering really good education, and delivering impact and engagement more generally as part of our mission, irrespective of metrics. And it seems to me there's a whole lot of things there that we need to engage a lot more thoroughly. And I wrote for myself 10 commandments that universities need to pursue in this manner. It was really 9, but I stretched it to 10 by dividing one up into 2 just to make it work. And my motivation for this was the broader position of Australia right now. We've got a position where business is incredibly short-termist, where the public service is too responsive to government, where the media is hollowing out, and where interest groups are the blockers of change. So in that institutional environment, to make Australia great again, if Malcolm Turnbull wants to pursue that line.
Should have a red tie on.
Blue in Australia, as you know. I think universities have a crucial role to play. And we've had some problems of our own in recent years. I think the managerialism that is... Sorry, I thought I'd turned that off. It's unknown. Okay. The managerialism that's taken over Indeed, there was a question being asked in China about economies of scale. And the studies I've seen show that, in fact, there's economy scales to about a student enrolment about 15,000. You then go up to about 30,000, it's pretty flat. After 30,000, it's diseconomies of scale. And yet we've got Australian universities running up to 6,000. So that there may be that we've gone too far, and what that does is produce a huge superstructure of managerial duplication that I think inhibits the academic enterprise. So there's some issues about how we deal with that in the universities. And I remember a talk from Brian Schmidt, who's no mean academic chappie, seems to have done well in some metrics of academic achievement, that when he was asked by the emeritus fellows who all grumble about these things recently, he was asked, the bureaucratic overload's just too much. How come the university's now gone so bureaucratic? It used to be so much better in the good old collegial days. And Brian's response was, the government that makes us do it. He wouldn't concede that there is a whole lot of discretion still within the university to manage well. And having just done a 1-hour lecture for the university, for the China Scholarship Council, where I had to produce my passport, my documentation of my educational qualifications, my birth certificate, and a business number for a 1-hour lecture. And then afterwards I was told that actually I wasn't going to get paid. This was part of professional development for academics in the university. I thought Brian needs to actually get out a bit more. I know he manages by walking, but I think people are a bit too deferential to a Nobel Prize winner, and there would be some advantage for him putting on a moustache and a dark hat or something and sitting at the back of a few lecture theatres and going along to a few meetings. There's a lot we can do there. There's another one. I don't know if any of you ever watched Kurt Wallander, the Swedish detective show. Well, last night's one, he was being quizzed on his role as a detective, and he said, do we make a difference? Sometimes. Not much. But what we do know is we must never stop trying. And I think this is what too many academics at the moment are giving up. They're suffering like Anne suffered and saying, well, why should I bother anymore? Or you ask them, well, would you recommend to your kids that you want an academic career? 15 years ago, they would have said, most of them, yes. You ask them now, and they don't. They basically say, no, the life's not what it was. Now, part of that's just demographic ageing, but it's more than that. It really is the nature of the work. But my personal hero in research here was Max Corden, who gave a talk at the Academy of Social Sciences meetings last week, and a week before last. And Max is 91. And he was made an Academy Jubilee Fellow, which is 40 years as a Fellow of the Academy. And Max, to people of my generation, was the hero who hung in there writing about tariffs and the nature of their impact on our economy for 10, 15, 20 years, providing the analysis by which you understood tariffs. And policy never changed. High tariffs in Australia, no reform of tariffs, if anything, making them worse. And then it changed. And Max finally got a change in tariff policy through his colleague Fred Gruen working for Gough Whitlam, and then later through Ross Garnaut working for Bob Hawke. And so this switch point phenomenon, an osmotic effect phenomenon, so hard to trace in engagement and impact and so on, and so long in time, which shows the difficulties of documenting these things. I was so delighted that Max at 91 had that in his history of that achievement and that satisfaction. And now he tells us he's still waiting for the Nobel Prize. And we're expecting that any time for him, of course. So I think academics sticking to their last is one important lesson. The other is maintaining your eternal vigilance in universities, which is sticking to your truth as universities. Issues like research integrity shouldn't be buried. They've got to be up there as a key performance indicator of management of universities, and not a source of worrying about the embarrassment, but turn it around and make your vigilance part of your achievement as a university of excellence. So far too often at Universities of Australia I saw the burying going on rather than the proper dealing with this in a transparent and rigorous way. Getting the incentives right is crucial, because not only is it the incentives that the ARC and government set for us, it's our own internal incentives. When your dean comes along to you and says, right, unless you're producing 2 publishable articles in an A-star journal each year, we're going to review your promotion and whether you indeed can have your fixed-term appointment continued. And that sort of structure is an internal university matter. It's not dictated by government at the individual academic level. You've got to work with partners as universities, communities, industry, and community sector, and not just the government all the time, but the community sector and industry. And too often we focus on Canberra and the central government, but we've got to do a lot more than that. And we've got to fight back. That is, as we're doing with Shaping the Nation, as we may be doing with case studies, showing what we do in a whole range of ways and communicating it. And we've got to provide solutions. If there are problems there, don't just complain and whinge, but provide answers and ways forward. So many academics say, you know, here's the pearls before the swine, here's the problem, fix it. And then it's left to government to go ahead and fix it, and then they'll get criticised later for how they went about it. But it does seem to me we have an obligation, this comes back partly to interdisciplinarity, bringing the policy implementation people together with the policy designers, for instance, in ways that doesn't happen in separate silos. Listening and being concerned with the public, because that ultimately affects what business and government want from us. Cherry-picked from around the globe. I was appalled when I worked in the Department of Finance for 6 months recently, and I had a team of about 25 people, and about 12 of them were PhDs from the university, and we had to do, I can say it now, it went to Cabinet, a review of employment programs under the Abbott government. And the team were asked to produce a brief as to how we would analyse this problem. And the team went away and came back a couple of weeks later, and what they'd done was check what the submissions were to various inquiries and check with their colleagues in the core coordinating departments and the cabinet offices of several state departments as to what the issues were. And they never once thought to go to even line departments or line departments in the states, or look to overseas governmental precedent and issues, nor look at the academic literature. And this is, you know, a dozen plus PhDs. And it was just what they think about each other at the core of government.
Well, they're all ANU PhDs.
No.
Just checking.
But you're right, yes, you're quite right. And they weren't all economists either. But, and then there's a final one, which is to offer reciprocation in the process. When we demand, for instance, when we're demanding money, let's say government wants us to do these sorts of things and we want more money to incentivate ourselves, which proved in the federalism reform era to be a fantastic way of having state governments do microeconomic reform. If we can do that with by showing how we are improving governmental university efficiency, and things symbolically like the $1 million Vice Chancellors are going to be used mercilessly against us. And Brian Schmidt, for instance, has taken a wonderful precedent there of indeed taking a pay cut because he didn't think he should have a ratio 3 times higher than the next officer in the university type relativity. That more of that sort of symbolism at that some personal cost for Vice Chancellors, and generalise that across the improvement of the university management system that I mentioned earlier, and we'll be in a stronger position to then say to government, you've got to play your part in a reciprocal obligation, mutual obligation here. So they're the sorts of games I think we should be looking at around the impact and engagement agenda, and put ourselves into a broader context of getting universities which perform very well, but to perform even better. And not to slip backwards too, as China keeps trying to knock us off the perch. Let them knock the Yanks off. At the moment, it is the Americans who are falling back in the top 200 or so. Most other areas are staying pretty much the same or advancing, like China and some of the Asian economies are, and the Americans are falling back. There's been a change in the last decade of about I think it's 15 positions, and it's the Americans who've gone down and the Chinese and a couple of others have gone up. So that was what I was going to say, and we've still got some time for questions and answers, but I think the optimal panel should be 3, not 4, I've just realised, for an hour and a half. So could we open up for queries? I think Meredith put her hand up here.
Hi, that was fascinating. But I'm left a little confused, especially after hearing Don and Anne, immediately Anne after Don. For Don, for me, it was about research excellence leading to research impact. It was about research impact. With Anne, it was more about policy impact, not necessarily through high quality research. It might be high quality research, but it's not recognised as such in a journal article. And it reminded me of, I didn't think of the Max Borden Enlightenment effect and Bruin coming in behind, but it reminded me of Bruce Chapman, who did, as we all know, he's the architect of HEX, etc. He didn't do that through an article in a high quality journal. He did it the hard way that Anne was talking about. So, but then he was more or less, I don't think you mind saying, got his promotion by publishing the book on income contingent loans, which didn't get a larger readership because it was published, you know, like Cambridge or somewhere, it cost a lot of money. But he did what he needed to do to get the recognition. So it's this contrast. I'm a little confused in the language. Do we want research impact through excellence in journals? And I think that's what the ARC once said when I heard them a few months ago here at ANU. Or do we want it the other way? Or are we talking about two different output streams? The journal article and the interaction, the dialogue to get the policy impact, and then looking to the outcomes that come through either one of those outputs. I think I would like clarification there about what it is we're talking about when we talk about impact.
Anne and Don then, to come back.
Can I go first?
Go.
Yeah, go first.
Okay.
A beats D.
I would assume that any worthwhile participation in a public debate was underpinned by excellence. That would be my working. So in that Sam's case, for example, we would have spent years and years before that fine-tuning the techniques that allowed you to answer this policy question when it bubbled up and to answer it quickly and accurately.
It wasn't journal articles that you would have written, but not in this specific
Well, yeah, partly, but I mean, it can, in some fields, it can be very hard to get any journal outlets, which is, in fact, why I mentioned that other journal.
Yeah, I mean, I was very clear about a conscious decision taken in the UK, which was that research excellence is assessed first, and that the case studies were derived from excellent research. Now the point of debate is how you assess research excellence, and in the case of the humanities, it might be a book in history, for example. In the case of medicine, it might be a publication in a leading journal. But the point is, the assessment was done by by peers as to what represented excellence in research, and then impact was a derivative from excellent research. So your example's spot on, actually. Sounds to me like you did a tremendous amount of original, high-quality research in order to develop the modelling techniques that you subsequently had the chance to apply. Speaking now as a Vice-Chancellor, I'd have leapt on that as a case study, because it has a foundation in excellent research undertaken within the university that resulted in tangible impact on public policy.
Can I add to that? And you can't buy that anywhere else. Right? So you often hear that term bandied around, high impact research. As for me, it means high impact both as it's judged by your peers, which gives you academically rigorous, methodologically rigorous, theoretically rigorous, etc. research. That's what gives you credibility in order to go out and engage, I think, through your research. So that's how I see it. The other thing is, there is a problem with defining engagement and impact. I talk about engagement as the process by which you get to impact. But if you take some of the examples we've talked about of people sitting on advisory boards, major bodies, what's got them there is actually impact, and then they're engaging, and there may be some further impact. So it's a bit cyclical, and I'm not sure whether we're setting them up as binary opposites almost. I'm not entirely sure that they're not one and the same thing sometimes, which makes it harder to assess.
I reckon engagement's a bit like an impact, and excellence is a bit like a marriage. You actually get there.
Yeah.
So I think the important point I would make is that you'd have no chance of explaining the relationship between the work that you did and the impact that it had, that enabled you to have on public policy without case study.
Yes.
And that's where social sciences and the humanities can get stuffed if there's not this opportunity to tell the story, basically. And that's why I say I've become a bit of a fan of case studies for that reason.
Hal, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Has anybody used the word knowledge?
Good point.
What is known as the outcome of research and how that is then communicated? Engagement without knowledge and impact of knowledge. Why aren't we using these words? And is there a metric somehow through judgment or whatever of knowledge? Is that too abstract?
No, but if I could answer it, it's crucial to that two-way issue we've been talking about. One is where you get somebody who's a good general scholar, has done lots of research, and they go and advise government and come up with a new idea. But it wasn't from a specific research project or investigation. It was their general approach to knowledge, and advanced scholarly knowledge in that case. And that's the Bruce Chapman sort of case. Whereas the other case is you've done the research and advanced knowledge in the process, and it's been attested in a peer-reviewed journal, and then you apply it somewhere, particularly through a patent that gets commercialised or whatever, and you've got both academic and commercial knowledge benefits. But the two can happen, the two are very worthwhile.
I agree, and the simplistic model in government is that knowledge is created and that it's transferred. And knowledge is a joint production of the doing and the applying. And how do we get that into these policies?
One is the transmission of knowledge, the other is the creation of knowledge, which are slight distinctions. The creation is the new research. But the border is really blurred.
So where should we put the emphasis?
Both. All of the above.
I think it's a good point. That knowledge creation and knowledge exchange were terms that were used 10 years ago in this, as this debate started to emerge, and suddenly they've got lost. And I think some of the reason that they've got lost might be to do with some of the points that Glenn raised about thinking about value for money, and it's a much more engagement as a resource, etc. So I think it's a fair point, but we don't use those terms in the current debate.
And partly it soon becomes knowledge for its own sake, which is what they're trying to get us away from. David.
If I could just make a comment on Dan's case study, because I was very closely involved. Anne and the team did an outstanding job in the design of this model. And it was a very powerful instrument to use with ministers. You're sitting there in this Minister Review Committee and people are saying, well, what if we do this and what if we do that? And we could actually ask them immediately. There was a lot of other evidence-based work also done in that inquiry, and we were determined to have a strong evidence base for our policy development. But when you look at the archaeological dig, it goes back years. I mean, Meredith was working on these things in the 80s, the Family Law Act in 1975, and so you have a body of research evidence that built up, and an expectation built up with ministers that this was an area where evidence was important. Because it was so conflicted, they wanted to see evidence. So it's very hard to get that temporal dimension into your assessment of what the impact of your research is. Because you stand on the shoulders of lots of other researchers that goes right like that.
Mike?
There was a rumour that Cambridge wanted to include Newton's work in their submission.
Submitted, co-author.
I got the sense, listening particularly to Don and Anne, that this was all about how researchers get recognised and rewarded. I guess I don't know much about that. I'm more interested in actually how they have an influence. And addressing that, I think you were right, Glenn, when you talked about the very long lead times in changing policy. I'd give a different version to Max Gordon's contribution to you. I don't think it was that important that he got a couple of well-placed followers in Fred and Ross Garner. I think what was important is he developed a measure to show the cost of protection.
Yeah, effective protection.
And that got massive publicity over a long time, and that created a set of interest groups who understood how they were being ripped off. People in the trade were exporters, and they were the ones who changed the policy in the end. A couple of well-placed individuals, I think, better than most do, and over a longer period.
But I think you're making the case for a case study, not just an anecdote. I gave a little simple anecdote, but in fact, it's complex.
But if you're going to have a really big influence on area policy, it's not just when the review's done. It's getting people sufficiently aware over a period that a review is necessary. Now, just another comment I'd make is, or a question, is how well are academics organised for that sort of world? Now, I was one of the Academy's two representatives on a review of technology and its impact on our society, our security, our economy, everything. One of the things discovered from that is that the links between academics working in technology and industry, according to OECD data, is worse than any other country, any other advanced country. Maybe it's just the technologists, but maybe it goes broader than the technologists to Australian universities more generally, that they're fixed on publication in an academic journal, preferably an overseas one. I agree with that. It's very hard to get published in an overseas journal with it on an Australian case study. That I sort of wonder whether what Dave was talking about, whether you really need to work more in teams than academics are prone to want to do, not only across disciplinary teams, but teams more generally. So I just say as someone who tries to use the work of academics for policy, public policy, I get, when I go to look for evidence that I can use on a policy question, I'd go to a place like the Grattan Institute, I'd go to someone like NATSIM, I used to, and I'd go to someone like the Productivity Commission. Now NATSIM did the original work, but mostly the Grattan Institute or Productivity Commission are not doing the original work, they're taking the work of academics, but they're communicating in a way that makes it much more accessible to policy makers. And I just wonder whether academics need to think, because there aren't many middlemen at the moment, and whether they ought to be thinking more in terms of how they communicate. But also, can you develop the policy-related work, which is by just individuals?
Any more
I'll make
Anne?
one quick comment. I was just going to comment that I think you set those up as two things that are, again, going back to what Meredith was saying, inextricably linked. So if you want to have influence and you want to improve the society and you want to improve people's lives, then you have to be recognised and rewarded for many, many research academics. So NATSIM's situation was much more perilous than for a number of research institutes, but it was an entirely self-funding environment. We paid the university rent. There were no infrastructural subsidies coming to us, really. And so if the performance metrics were not linked to us getting cash, then we couldn't keep doing the research. End of story. There was no debate about it.
Anyway, David? Yeah?
Yeah, so the two-part answer. One is you can put in place rewards that lead, and mechanisms that lead to recognition and so on. You can build it into performance reviews. That's all part of the process that you're talking about. That's within the control of universities, but actually it's a cultural issue. And some people respond to it. And some people love engaging in that way with stakeholders, and others just do not. I would say that there's also a greater understanding among newly minted academics that are coming through, an appreciation of the need to engage and demonstrate impact than among perhaps more senior generations. So it's, what you're talking about is if we want it, is something that's going to take a while to take effect, in my view. There have always been some people that love doing it and are really good at it, but the vast majority of academics are still very focused on the publications track, and we are partly responsible for that occurring, given what we've seen with the ref and era here.
The sort of metrics that Anne was referring to
Yeah.
about getting rewards for
Yeah.
not publication, contributing.
Yeah. We don't.
Yeah, that's engagement.
Yeah. We don't celebrate it, or didn't celebrate it as much as we should.
Then I've got to record every meeting I go to and who was present and have it signed off by the chair. We're just about running out of time, so Peter and Hal.
There are a lot of very senior ex-public service here who will have a better idea of this sort of observation I'm going to make. One of the biggest policy impacts you can have is to stop things happening. And
Don't need research to do that.
well, sometimes, yeah, sort of, it helps. And so you've got something you can't measure in a way, or you can only measure it by a case study. But perhaps it is actually, so it's not
the case isn't to be made by the academics, but the case is to be made by asking the policymakers about impact. But I don't know how easy that is to do, to set up the processes by which you have that sort of feedback rather than the academics coming up with the case.
That almost raises the question of an annual survey by the ARC of department heads, asking their departments what research and academic input they found most useful in their policy making during the past year. Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. That's the danger. But it's same with refereeing, peer review.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, we were just about running out of time, but Hal had one more, and Andrew has been waving at the back. So Hal,
Go ahead, Andrew, I'll come in after you.
It seems to me that the key issue is the one that was touched on by both Mike and David, is this issue of intermediaries. Meredith and I have done a lot of work in this area, and how you have a funding stream around an intermediary. The ARC sometimes does it, say, in the way they handle centres of excellence, which has an element of partnerships and so on around it. But there's nothing stopping universities having their own, within their funding, deciding on streams such as the Grattan Institute or other arrangements. It just seems to me that if you want to get a financial reward arrangement, some funding of the intermediary between quality research, the excellence research, and the translation in terms of impact for policy and so on. Mike and I had an experience only a year or so ago where a group of us set up a committee on sustainable retirement incomes. We didn't have a stream of money. There was no money that we had to generate it ourselves, and was quite a struggle. But we linked into the Centre of Excellence on Population Ageing, and we did quite a good job. But I sit back and say it wasn't easy because the university didn't have an arrangement, nor did any of the departments put money up. They would come and they would contribute personally, but they wouldn't put any dollars on the table. So I think that intermediary funding is really important.
Maybe in the STEM sphere, medical research institutes are a sort of partial example, and even the Grattan Institute is under the auspice, in a sort of loose way, of Melbourne University. yeah, these intermediaries, and how you link to the BCGs and McKinseys and so on, who are intermediaries too for academic knowledge, as was said before. We've got to assess that world, whereas universities tend to keep looking inwards all the time and at their immediate competition, their immediate peers, and not this external context which is taking over a range of university functions in a range of ways, just as, who knows, TAFE might be putting in a bid for applied research funding soon to the Commonwealth, and unis don't even think they're a potential competitor. Sorry, Hal.
The point I'd make is that universities are very poorly organized. We quibble over metrics for a promotion of an individual without any of the context. And obviously, for big things to get done, you need an entrepreneurial leader who often sacrifices much of their lives to get something up in the name of impact and quality and attract people to come with you. But that's not the way universities are structured. And unless you can get a big pot of money like Grattan got, but there's no other way. CPAR was about as close as we can get in the university system. John Piggott's done that, won that.
Through the Centre of Excellence.
Yeah, but that's scale and leadership, and all the rest comes with it. How do we do it?
Well, we did have at the Academy of Social Sciences annual meetings last week, and
Okay,
John gave a mentoring class on how to get a Centre of Excellence, so that's one way we're trying to do it.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's now getting late, and panel wants to go to dinner, I'm understanding, that if you could thank the panel for their contribution this evening, and thank yourselves.